Please, I need a way out. This feels wrong. Elara Voss whispered the words into the cold porcelain of the restaurant bathroom, her breath hitching as she stared at her reflection. She looked flawless, a silk dress that hugged her curves, hair swept into an elegant updo, and makeup designed to hide the flicker of panic in her eyes. But beneath the expensive fabric, her skin crawled. She was on a first date with Grant Holloway, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes and whose gentlemanly charm felt more like a cage. She checked her phone, hopping for a lifeline from the friend who had set them up. The reply was chillingly dismissive. "You're overthinking it. Grant is a catch. Just relax and let him take the lead." So Elara did what she had spent her whole life doing. She swallowed her fear. She walked back out to the candle-lit table, sat across from the man who was slowly suffocating her with his intensity, and tried to pretend she wasn't counting the minutes until she could flee. But someone else in the room wasn't pretending. Sitting 3 tables away was a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom or a battlefield. Kang Min-jae sat in a perfectly tailored black suit, his sharp, observant eyes tracking every micro-expression on Elara's face. He wasn't looking at his phone or the menu. He was watching the way Grant's hand hovered too close to Elara's throat. And when Grant finally reached out, his fingers tightening around Elara's wrist in a grip that was meant to dominate, Min-jae set his glass down. The silent authority in his gaze shifted into something lethal. What happened next would force Elara to choose between the safety of her silence and the danger of a savior who was a monster to the rest of the world. But to understand how Elara ended up at that table, begging for help she didn't think would come, we have to go back 2 weeks. 2 weeks earlier, Elara had been in her apartment, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a bouquet of apology flowers Grant had sent after their first accidental meeting. He had been persistent, charming, and wealthy, everything she was told she needed. On her coffee table sat a half-eaten carton of takeout and a laptop open to a job search she was losing hope in. She had been trying to find her footing, unaware that she was already being hunted by 2 very different types of predators. The candle-lit elegance of the restaurant shattered the moment Grant's fingers tightened like a shackle around Elara's wrist. His face remained a mask of polished control, but his eyes were dark with a terrifying, familiar entitlement. "You're not going anywhere, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low, jagged blade. "We haven't finished our conversation." Elara's breath hitched, her "help me" still an invisible echo in the air. She braced for the usual, the polite indifference of the diners around them, the crushing weight of her own silence. Then the air in the room shifted. A shadow fell over the table, cold and absolute. "I believe the lady said she wanted to leave." The voice was a deep, melodic baritone that silenced the clatter of silverware. Grant looked up, his sneer faltering as he met the sharp, unblinking gaze of Kang Min-jae. The Korean businessman stood like an obsidian statue, the dark tattoo at the base of his neck peeking out from a crisp white collar, a subtle, lethal warning to anyone smart enough to read it. Grant let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "This is a private matter. Who the hell are you?" Min-jae didn't blink. He didn't shout. He simply reached down and placed a hand over Grant. It was a slow, deliberate movement, but the moment his fingers made contact, Grant's face drained of color. The sheer, effortless power in Min-jae's grip was enough to force Grant's hand open, his fingers splaying wide in a humiliating release. "I am the man who is ending this date," Min-jae said, his tone as calm as a frozen lake. He stepped between them, his massive frame effectively erasing Grant's presence. He turned to Elara, his expression softening by a fraction, not out of pity, but out of a strange, grounded respect. "Ms. Voss, my car is outside." The entire restaurant was watching. The elite of the city stared as Grant Holloway, the man who prided himself on being untouchable, sat there trembling, his authority stripped away by a single look from a stranger. Elara didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the man who had tried to own her. She stood, her legs trembling but her spirit suddenly anchored by the silent man at her side. Min-jae placed a steadying hand on the small of her back, a touch that felt like a shield rather than a restraint, and led her through the hushed room. Outside, the cool night air hit her skin like a benediction. A sleek, black sedan sat idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the city lights like a predator's eyes. A driver held the door open as Min-jae guided her inside. As the heavy door thudded shut, sealing out the world, Elara realized she had traded one kind of danger for another. But as she looked at Min-jae's stoic profile in the dim light of the cabin, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer a victim. She was a guest of the syndicate. The interior of the sedan was a sanctuary of hushed luxury and chilled air, smelling faintly of expensive leather and something metallic, like the ozone before a storm. As the car glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city, Elara watched the neon lights blur against the glass. Beside her, Kang Min-jae remained a statue of silent authority. He hadn't asked where she lived. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He simply existed in the space next to her, a gravity well that pulled all her frantic thoughts into his orbit. The car slowed as it entered the private basement of a glass and steel monolith that pierced the clouds. When the doors opened, Min-jae led her toward a private elevator. "This is the Obsidian Lounge," he said, his voice a low vibration as they ascended. "You are safe here. My men do not let anything through these doors that hasn't been vetted by me." The elevator opened into a space that felt less like a lounge and more like a fortress of modern elegance. Floor to ceiling, windows overlooked the sprawling city, but the room itself was cast in shadows and deep charcoals. Elara walked toward the glass, her reflection ghosting over the twinkling lights of the skyline. She saw Min-jae behind her, removing his blazer to reveal the full extent of the ink scaling his neck and disappearing beneath his shirt. "I know who you are now," Elara whispered, her voice trembling as she turned to face him. She had seen the whispers on the news, the dragon of the underworld, a man whose family name was synonymous with the city's silent power and brutal efficiency. "You're not just a businessman. You're the reason people avoid certain alleys. You're the reason the police look the other way." Min-jae walked toward her, his pace slow and predatory. He stopped just inches away, his height forcing her to tilt her head back. "I am a man who deals in reality, Elara. The reality is that Grant Holloway would have followed you home. The reality is that he believes he owns you because he has a bank account and a pedigree." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his thumb brushed the line of her jaw. His touch was warm, surprisingly steady, and devoid of the grasping entitlement she had felt from Grant. "You asked for help," he murmured, his dark eyes searching hers. "In my world, a request for help is a contract. I have provided sanctuary, but you are wondering if the dragon's nest is just another cage." Elara felt the weight of his words. For the first time, she wasn't being told what to do. She was being presented with a terrifying truth. Grant had wanted to break her spirit. Min-jae seemed to want to sharpen it. She looked at the door, then back at the man who stood like a sentinel between her and the world that had tried to silence her. "Is it?" she asked softly. Min-jae's lips quirked into the ghost of a smile, sharp, dangerous, and intoxicating. "The door isn't locked, Elara. You can walk out and go back to the whispers, or you can stay here and learn how to roar." The sanctuary of the Obsidian Lounge was silent, but the air felt charged, as if the city's electricity was being funneled directly into the room. Elara sat on the edge of a plush velvet sofa, her phone resting on the heavy marble coffee table like a live grenade. Since she had stepped into Min-jae's world, the silence of the night had been punctuated by the frantic, rhythmic buzzing of notifications. She didn't have to pick it up to know what they said. The first few had been apologies, hollow, frantic scripts about misunderstandings and passion. But as the hours ticked by and Elara remained silent, the mask Grant Holloway had worn so carefully for months didn't just slip, it disintegrated. "You think you're clever, hiding behind a thug." The screen lit up with a jagged flash of blue light. "I made you, Elara. Without my name, you're nothing but a girl in a pretty dress. I'm coming to get what belongs to me." A cold shiver raced down her spine, the kind of dread that made the blood feel like ice water in her veins. This was the man her friends called a catch. This was the man who had held her wrist with a smile just hours ago. The ghost of the Grant she thought she knew was gone, replaced by a snarling, desperate predator who viewed her as a debt to be collected. Min-jae appeared from the shadows of the kitchenette, carrying 2 glasses of dark tea. He didn't ask to see the phone. He didn't need to. He watched the way her hands trembled as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "The polite ones are always the most broken," Min-jae said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the room. He set the tea down and picked up her phone with a clinical indifference. He scrolled through the barrage of vitriol, his expression remaining as unreadable as stone. He is spiraling. He realizes that for the first time in his life, his money cannot buy the outcome he wants. "He says he's coming for me," Elara whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the penthouse. "Grant doesn't lose, he doesn't know how." Min-jae leaned forward, his presence blotting out the flickering light of the phone. He reached out, his thumb tracing the pulse point at her neck, which was drumming a frantic rhythm. "Let him come," Min-jae murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, protective intensity. "Grant Holloway is a man who hides behind lawyers and bank statements. I am a man who hides behind nothing. He is a ghost, Elara, and ghosts have no power over the living." As another message lit up the screen, "I see you." Elara realized the haunting was just beginning. But as Min-jae's hand shifted to cover hers, she felt the first spark of something other than fear. It was a cold, sharp resolve. The ghost of Grant was trying to pull her back into the dark, but the man sitting beside her was teaching her how to thrive in it. The following morning, the sun didn't rise so much as it bruised the sky with a dull, metallic gray. Min-jae didn't offer Elara breakfast or platitudes. Instead, he led her to the bowels of the building, where a reinforced steel door opened into a sprawling, windowless space that smelled of gym mats and cold iron. "Grant Holloway feeds on your flinch," Min-jae said, his voice echoing in the hollow training facility. He had traded his suit for a slate-gray compression shirt, the dragon tattoo on his neck now fully visible as it trailed down his shoulder like a living shadow. "He wins because you look away when things become uncomfortable. You seek safety in the shadows, hoping he'll lose interest. He won't." He stood in the center of the matted floor and beckoned her forward. Elara felt small in the vast room, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she reached him, he didn't hand her a weapon. He didn't tell her to strike. He simply stepped into her personal space, his towering frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her. "Hold my gaze, Elara," he commanded. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, radiating a controlled, predatory heat. It was the same overwhelming pressure she had felt from Grant, the same sensation of being pinned by a force far greater than her own. Instinctively, Elara's eyes darted toward the floor, her shoulders hunching as she tried to make herself invisible. "Again," Min-jae murmured, his hand coming up to catch her chin, tilting her head back up. "Power isn't about the size of your fist. It is about the refusal to be intimidated. Look at me." For the next hour, he moved around her, a constant, circling threat. He spoke of the syndicate, of the enemies who watched for the slightest blink, the smallest tremor of the lip. He taught her that the dragon's mark wasn't just the ink on his skin. It was the unwavering stare of someone who refused to be a victim. "Grant is a predator who hunts those who hide," Min-jae said, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. "But even a wolf hesitates when its prey stares back with fire in its eyes." By the time they finished, Elara's muscles were trembling, but her gaze was steady. She looked at the man who was both her captor and her catalyst, and for the first time she didn't see a monster. She saw a mirror. She realized that Min-jae wasn't trying to change who she was. He was stripping away the layers of politeness and obedience that had kept her paralyzed. As they walked back to the elevator, Elara caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. The girl who had whispered for help in the restaurant was gone. In her place stood a woman with a cold, sharp focus. She wasn't just a guest in the dragon's nest anymore. She was starting to understand the weight of the fire he carried. And she was finally ready to stop looking away. The grand crystal ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, a place where the city's elite gathered to trade secrets behind flute-thin glasses of champagne. Elara moved through the crowd with a newfound poise, her gown of deep emerald velvet catching the light. Beside her, Min-jae was a silent, looming shadow, his presence acting as a natural repellent to the curious and the bold. He had told her that tonight was a test, not of her strength, but of her vision. "He's here," Min-jae murmured, his voice barely a breath against her ear. 3 o'clock near the terrace doors. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't let her eyes dart toward the threat. Instead, she took a slow sip of her drink, feeling the cool liquid anchor her. She felt Grant's gaze before she saw him, a prickly, possessive heat that crawled up her spine. When he finally approached, he moved with the practiced ease of a man who believed the world was his stage. "Elara," Grant said, his voice dripping with a forced, oily warmth. He stepped into her personal space, ignoring Min-jae as if the Mafia boss were merely furniture. "You've had your fun playing dress-up with the help. It's time to come home. People are starting to talk." In the past, Elara would have looked at the floor. She would have stammered an excuse or sought a quick exit. But tonight, she remembered the basement mats and Min-jae's command to never look away. She turned her head slowly, meeting Grant's eyes with a level, icy stare that made his smug smile falter. "The only people talking, Grant, are the ones wondering why you're still hovering around a woman who clearly outgrew you," Elara said, her voice projecting just enough to catch the ears of the influential donors nearby. Grant's face flushed a violent shade of red. "Don't be difficult. You know you need me. My family's foundation is the only reason your firm even looks at you." Elara tilted her head, a sharp, knowing smile touching her lips. "Actually, I spoke with the board of directors 10 minutes ago. They were fascinated to learn about your recent erratic behavior. It seems they value stability over legacy. Perhaps you should worry less about my home and more about your seat on the committee." The silence that followed was deafening. Grant's mouth opened and closed, his polite mask shattering in front of the very people he spent his life trying to impress. He looked at Min-jae, expecting a physical threat, but found only the dragon's bored, mocking gaze. Elara didn't wait for his reply. She placed a hand on Min-jae's arm, not as a victim seeking a shield, but as a partner signaling the end of a dull conversation. "Enjoy the evening, Grant," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. As they walked away, leaving a humiliated Grant in the center of a whispering circle, Elara felt a surge of cold, clean triumph. She hadn't needed a gun or a fist. She had simply looked at the predator and refused to be prey. Min-jae's grip tightened slightly on her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the fire she had finally learned to control. The serenity of Min-jae's estate was shattered at 3 a.m. by the rhythmic, percussive cracks of breaking glass and the heavy thud of boots on the grand staircase. Elara woke to the cold bite of the night air and the sight of Min-jae already standing by the bedroom window, his silhouette a jagged line of obsidian against the moonlight. He didn't look startled. He looked ready. "Stay behind the reinforced door," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. But Elara didn't move toward the closet. She remembered the training facility, the mats, and the promise she had made to herself to stop hiding. "He's not here for a conversation, Min-jae," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "He's here to burn it all down." Downstairs, the marble foyer became a stage for a desperate, frantic violence. Grant had bypassed the main gates, driven by a cocktail of bruised ego and chemical courage. He stood in the center of the hall, a heavy crowbar in one hand and a handgun trembling in the other. He looked nothing like the polished executive from the gala. His hair was matted, his eyes bloodshot and wild, a man who had finally let his inner rot consume his exterior. "Come out," Grant screamed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Bring her out here, she's mine, you don't get to take what's mine." Min-jae descended the stairs with a slow, terrifying grace, his hands empty at his sides. He moved as if the bullets in Grant's gun were mere suggestions. Behind him, Elara stepped into the light of the landing, her eyes locked onto Grant. She didn't flinch when he leveled the barrel at her. "Drop the gun, Grant," Elara said. Her voice wasn't a whisper, it was a gavel. "The only thing you own is the ruin you've made of yourself." "Shut up," Grant lunged forward, but he was clumsy, fueled by rage rather than discipline. Min-jae moved like a blur of shadow and steel. He caught Grant's wrist mid-swing, the sound of bone meeting marble echoing through the hall as he slammed the younger man against a structural pillar. The gun clattered away, sliding across the polished floor. Min-ye's hand found Grant's throat, his fingers tightening with a clinical precision that stopped just short of lethal. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light. "I told you once," Min-ye hissed, his face inches from the sobbing, broken man. "She is not a prize, she is the fire, and you are just ash." Elara walked down the stairs, passing the gun without a glance. She stood before the man who had haunted her life, seeing him finally for what he was, small, weak, and utterly defeated. She didn't need Min-ye to pull the trigger. The sight of her standing tall, untouched, and unafraid was the ultimate execution of Grant's power. Blood smeared the white marble, but as the syndicate's security finally swarmed the room to remove the intruder, Elara realized the haunting was over. The ghost was exorcised. The heavy scent of metallic dust and expensive cologne hung in the air of Min-ye's private study. The chaos of the foyer had been swept away by silent, efficient men, but the atmosphere remained thick with the residue of violence. Min-ye stood by his desk, the moonlight catching the jagged lines of the dragon on his neck, making it look as though the beast were breathing. On the mahogany surface lay a single, slender flash drive and a thick dossier bound in black. "Grant Holloway is currently in a private holding cell," Min-ye said, his voice a low, steady hum that vibrated in the quiet room. "He is broken, Elara, but a broken man can still crawl back into the light if he has enough money to buy the stairs." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the files. "That dossier contains everything. The offshore accounts he used to embezzle from his family's foundation. The NDAs he forced on women before you, and the police reports that were paid to disappear. It is enough to erase his name from the city's history. He wouldn't just be ruined, he would be a ghost." Elara walked toward the desk, her fingers hovering over the cold plastic of the flash drive. She felt the weight of the moment, the finality of it. For months, Grant had used his legacy as a weapon to keep her small. Now that same legacy was laid bare, a collection of paper and digital ink that could dismantle him in a single afternoon. Min-ye moved behind her, his presence a warm, grounding force. He didn't touch her, but his proximity felt like a silent pact. "I can make this simple, Elara. One phone call to my associates, and the problem of Grant Holloway is solved permanently. No trial, no scandal, no return. He simply ceases to exist." He leaned down, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, absolute sincerity. "Or you can use that drive. You can take him to the courts, drag his name through the mud, and watch him lose every piece of the empire he used to hurt you. One is the way of the sword, the other is the way of the world." He reached out, his hand resting beside hers on the desk. "The choice is yours. I am the dragon, but in this room, you are the one who decides who burns." Elara looked at the dossier, then back at Min-ye. The fear that had defined her for years was gone, replaced by a cold, analytical clarity. She realized that killing Grant was too easy. It was a mercy he didn't deserve. She wanted him to live long enough to see everything he valued, his status, his pride, his name, turn to ash in his mouth. "I don't want him dead," Elara whispered, her hand closing firmly around the flash drive. Her voice was sharp, a new kind of steel. "I want him to watch while I take everything he thought made him untouchable. I want him erased while he's still breathing." Min-ye's lips quirked into a dark, satisfied smile. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect. "Then we begin the extraction. By tomorrow, the world will forget Grant Holloway ever mattered." The transition from prey to partner happened not in the bedroom, but in the war room. In the weeks following Grant's systematic erasure from the city's social and financial registers, Elara found herself spending less time in the velvet-draped sanctuary of the penthouse and more time in the high-security offices of the Kang Group. She had expected to be a trophy, a quiet presence at Min-ye's side to soften his lethal edges, but the dragon had other plans. One afternoon, Min-ye spread a series of complex logistical maps and digital ledgers across a glass conference table. He didn't look at her with the heavy, possessive heat she had grown accustomed to. Instead, his eyes were sharp, expectant, and professional. "The syndicate is expanding its legitimate shipping lanes into the European sector," Min-ye said, tracing a finger along a coastal route. "My advisors suggest a standard aggressive takeover of the local unions. I find that approach unimaginative, and loud. Elara leaned over the table, her mind instinctively clicking into the strategic gear she had spent years hunting in the marketing world. She saw the gaps his advisors had missed, not the physical vulnerabilities, but the psychological ones. "You don't need to take over the unions," she murmured, her eyes scanning the data. "You need to make them think they've won. If you restructure the subsidiary contracts to offer tiered incentives, you create a self-policing system. They'll protect your interests because they'll think it's their idea." The silence in the room was absolute. Min-jae leaned back, his hands steepled beneath his chin. The dragon on his neck seemed to shimmer in the harsh office lighting. He wasn't looking at the maps anymore. He was looking at her as if seeing a brand new weapon being forged in real time. "You have a mind for the invisible levers of power, Elara," he said, his voice a low, appreciative hum. "Most people in my world understand only the blade. They don't understand the influence." "Is that why I'm here?" Elara asked, her heart racing not with fear, but with the thrill of being truly seen. "To be the architect of your legitimate front." Min-jae stood and walked around the table, stopping just inches from her. He reached out, his hand resting on the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a familiar, grounding pressure. "I have enough soldiers, Elara. I have enough ghosts. What I lack is a partner who can see the world through a lens I was never taught to use." He tilted her head back, his gaze locking onto hers with a profound, terrifying respect. "I want you in every meeting. I want your signature on every major contract. I don't just want you in my life. I want you in the foundation of this empire. You were never meant to be a guest. You were meant to be the master of the house." In that moment, Elara realized that the monstrous man who had saved her hadn't just rescued her from a predator. He had rescued her from the small, quiet life she had been forced to live. She wasn't just safe. She was essential. The city skyline was a tapestry of amber and violet, viewed from the apex of the Kang Group's headquarters. A year ago, Elara would have looked at the sprawling urban maze and felt overwhelmed, a small figure lost in the machinery of other people's ambitions. Now, as the cool wind whipped her hair across her face, she didn't just see a city, she saw a blueprint. Min-jae stood beside her on the terrace, his hand resting comfortably in his pockets, his silhouette as sharp and unwavering as the glass towers surrounding them. The dragon on his neck was partially obscured by the high collar of a bespoke overcoat, but its presence was felt in every hushed breath of the staff and every respectful nod of the security detail. They were no longer a man and his ward. They were the new sovereigns of the city's hidden pulse. "The merger is complete," Elara said, her voice carrying a calm authority that needed no volume to be heard. "The old families have retreated. They realized that fighting us was more expensive than following us." Min-jae turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the rising moon. The predatory edge was still there, it would always be there, but it was tempered by a profound, visible pride. "You didn't just win them over, Elara. You restructured the very ground they stand on. They're not just following, they're dependent." He stepped closer, the warmth of his presence cutting through the evening chill. He reached out, his fingers interlacing with hers. His touch was no longer just a promise of protection, it was an acknowledgement of equality. Their love was a dangerous thing, forged in the heat of a boardroom coup and the blood-stained marble of a midnight attack, but it was the only thing in her life that had ever felt entirely honest. "They used to call me the dragon because they feared I would burn the city down," Min-jae murmured, pulling her hand to his lips. "Now they fear us because they know we own the fire." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the world they had built together. She had started this journey as a girl whispering for help in a restaurant bathroom, terrified of a man who thought he could own her. She ended it as a woman who held the keys to an empire, standing beside a man who had given her the one thing no one else ever had, the freedom to be powerful. As the lights of the city flickered to life below them, Elara didn't look back at the shadows. She stood tall in the light of their shared reign, a partner in every sense of the word, ready to rule the night.